What if you want to try polyamory, but you're really worried about STIs?
That's a great question.
Great question. This is Cathy Vartuli from the Intimacy Dojo.
And this is Dr. Liz from Sex Positive Psych.
So I think a lot of people are under the impression that if you're polyamorous, you're always having tons of sex.
With all random people.
All random people. Like giant orgies everywhere, right? And that the population of polyamorous people or people who are non-monogamous have higher rates of STIs, sexually transmitted infections.
Yeah. And I honestly did have that impression.
Yeah.
When I first went to Reid Mihalko's site years ago, I saw the stuff about poly and I'm like, ooh, sleazy, and I ran away. And
yeah.
It's not, actually.
Yeah, the reality is when we look at the research, people who engage in consensual non-monogamy tend to have lower rates of sexually transmitted infections than people who don't. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason we think that happens is that people in non-monogamous communities tend to be better about barrier use than people outside of those communities.
And getting tested.
They're better about getting tested. They're better about talking about their test results. They tend to have less stigma about STIs,
and
so they're more open to disclosing what they have, and they get what they have treated.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, the most dangerous situation you can have is someone who doesn't know that they have an STI because they don't ever get tested, or who doesn't tell you that they have an STI, or someone who just doesn't ever use barriers, right?
Yeah.
And people can choose to never use barriers, right? Like, as a human being, you can choose at any point what you want to do with your body sexually.
Right.
As long as you are giving informed consent to those having sex with you.
Right.
Right? But, like, realistically, the folks I know who are poly are actually much safer in their sex practices, much more risk-aware in their sex practices than those I know who practice normative, mainstream, monogamous dating.
I've dated, because I date people in the spectrum of poly, and I went out with, when I was first starting dating, I went out with a bunch of people that were, you know, kind of heteronormative, and I would talk to them about safer sex because a good sex geek does that. Mm-hmm. And they're like, oh, I've never been tested, but I'm sure I'm fine. And I could tell. And I'm like, no, you can't tell. And they might have had serial monogamous, they might have been monogamous, but they had dated like 10 people, had been sexual with them, and I'm like, you've never been tested? And they're like, no, I don't need to be.
Well, and I think that a lot of that attitude comes from this erroneous belief that people have that bad people get STIs.
Yeah. Part
of the way that STI stigma works is that it says that if you have an STI, you did something to deserve it, you're a bad, gross, nasty person.
Yeah. You were sinful, so therefore you're being punished.
Right, and if you're a good person, or a nice person, or a sexy person,
or a loving person,
you obviously won't have STIs.
Yeah.
The thing is, STIs are like a cold, right? Anyone can get them, right?
Well, and the most common STI is the common cold.
Yeah.
And you can get that. We've all had that.
Everyone's had the common cold, right? Things like herpes, right? HSV1, which most commonly appears orally, a lot of people get from like kissing their grandma when grandma had a cold sore.
Yeah.
Right? The stigma that we have around STIs is often far disproportionate to the effects it actually has on our lives or our bodies. Mm-hmm. Having herpes can be uncomfortable, it can be inconvenient, it can be frightening in terms of how people will react to you having it, but it doesn't actually really cause you that much physical harm in the long term. Even HIV these days, we have great medication for it. It's very treatable. There are people whose viral loads are undetectable, and the risk of transmission when you have an undetectable viral load is very, very small.
Yeah. So I encourage you, wherever you're at, it's useful to be educated about it. Mm-hmm. I know I used to have there was so much shame associated with STIs, I didn't want to look. Mm-hmm. And I went to China when I was in college, and I hadn't been sexually active at that point, but I was going overseas, so I had to be, at that time China was requiring testing. Mm-hmm. And I remember the deep, deep shame I had to go to the doctor to get this, even though I had a medical excuse and a required form filled out, just to talk to someone. And there are a lot of doctors that are still shame-based around this. A lot of doctors won't even test for herpes because so many people have herpes that they don't want to test them because it shames, they don't want the shame thing.
Well, and it's also like from a public health perspective, the herpes test is very expensive and doesn't necessarily give you very useful information. It tells you were exposed to the herpes virus because you have antibodies to it, but not necessarily that you have the herpes virus or could transmit it to someone else.
Or where on your body it is so that you could watch for it or whatever.
Yeah.
So being educated and being aware and letting some of the shame go around potentially having an STI, because anyone
can have an STI.
Yeah.
I have HSV1. I have oral cold sores. That's what it is, you know?
And I've had lovers for years that have HSV1, and I have not tested positive for it. And I'm also aware that I could test positive for it because I have lovers that have it. But understanding the risks. Excuse me.
And that the risks aren't just STIs, right? There are so many risks that are associated with any kind of sexual encounter that you have. There are emotional risks, relational risks, pregnancy, right? And when all you're worried about is whether you're going to get gonorrhea or chlamydia, you're missing out on a lot of the risks that you actually might benefit from thinking about. And gonorrhea and chlamydia generally aren't that huge a deal as long as you get them treated.
And some of they're not the resistant ones, which are relatively rare still, thank God.
Pretty rare, yeah.
So yeah, I would encourage you to explore. I wouldn't avoid a type of relationship based on that fear.
Yeah, if poly's not the right fit for you, it's not the right fit for you. But a lot of the concerns that I hear about poly are, oh my gosh, but I'm going to get an STI, or oh, but I'm going to feel jealous. People feel jealous in monogamous relationships all the time. No one says don't do monogamy because you'll feel jealous.
That's hilarious. Yeah, let's talk about jealousy next.
Yeah, we'll talk about jealousy. All right, if you have comments about STIs, down here.
Congratulations on taking this time for yourself and learning these things. If you'd like to follow more of this, you can subscribe to my channel here. Social media is up here, and there's more videos of this type here. See you soon.